But before we begin this morning, let's have a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for, again, the Sabbath, that we can come together to worship you. We thank you for the opportunity that each of us has to be here and to learn from your word. I ask that you would bless me as I go over some of the history of our church this morning, that we may see some lessons that we can apply to our lives and that will draw us closer to you. In the name of your Son, Christ, we pray. Amen. All right, so since it has been so long since I presented part 1 here, I thought I might do a little bit of an overview. So in our last study, we looked at how William Miller went from being a farmer in upstate New York to being a preacher that went all over New England, all over the United States at the time, preaching the second coming of Christ. And we saw how other ministers began to pick up that message until it became a nationwide movement, the Millerite movement. We also saw some of the different preachers that were involved in that and some of the experiences that they had, as well as how the Sabbath came to the attention of some of these Millerite believers through Rachel Oakes and Frederick Wheeler. But today, we're going to rewind a little bit. We're going to look at the backgrounds and the lives of 3 people who eventually would go on to found the Seventh-day Adventist Church before the disappointment, and see what their lives were like. So these 3 people that I have selected for this are James White, Ellen White, and Joseph Bates. And I would like to start with James White. He was born the 5th of 9 children to John and Betsy White on August 4th, 1821. Unlike most of his brothers and sisters, he was a sickly child and at the age of 3 contracted a disease that was known at the time as worm fever. Doesn't sound very nice. But during the course of his illness, this fever became so high that somehow it caused his eyes to cross permanently, and he couldn't see anything. Unfortunately, this condition continued long after he recovered from the worm fever, and when he attempted to attend school at the age of 7, the teacher had to break the news to his father that there was no hope of James gaining an education because he couldn't see clearly enough to read or write. Though he was disheartened at the prospect of going through life illiterate, he made himself useful on the family farm, and soon what he lacked in knowledge, he made up for in his physical strength. But by the age of 16, he began to notice that his eyesight was gradually improving, until at the age of 19, one day he found that his sight was completely restored. At the first opportunity, he then went to the nearby school at St. Albans and enrolled in the classes there. Now, it must have seemed, that's his house, where he was born, excuse me, I forgot to turn there. But it must have seemed a bit of a strange sight to have this 6-footer sitting among young children in the classroom. But James applied himself diligently and soon passed up all the other students. By the end of the term, which was only 12 weeks, he had learned so much that his teacher handed him a certificate stating that he was qualified to teach primary school. Now, that winter, he taught in the nearby town of Troy, Maine, after which he attended another semester of school himself. At the end of that semester, his teacher told him that if he studied for just one more semester, he would qualify for college. This sent his dreams soaring. However, God had other plans. By now, it was the early 1840s, and the Millerite movement, that we learned about last time, was sweeping the country. 1 week after he returned home from school, he was in a conversation with his mother when she mentioned that a Brother Oakes of Boston had been preaching in town about the Second Advent. James had heard about these Millerites. He did not have a very high opinion of them. But finally, after much protest, his mother convinced him to attend these meetings. And as he listened each night, he became convicted that it was the truth. Now, this presented him with a new problem. For now he had this constant impression, almost a voice, speaking to him saying, "Visit your scholars," telling him to go and see each of his students from Troy to tell them what he had learned. But this, he decided, he was not going to do. It was about time for him to go back to school for his third semester. If he went to visit his students now, he would miss an opportunity to further his education. This went on for several weeks until one day he left for school, or when he left for school, the voice was getting louder and louder, and finally he said, "No, I will not go." After that, he packed his bags and headed off to school. But as he was walking to the school, a local church elder, Elder Bridges, who was also headed the same way, came by and picked up James in his buggy. This James was grateful for, until Elder Bridges began talking about what a fine minister James would make. Once he arrived at school, he settled down into his studies, but only for a short time, for the voice was still persistent and became louder and louder, till finally he couldn't concentrate on anything that he was studying. Finally he shouted, "All right, I'll go visit my scholars." He set out that very afternoon, and over the course of the next several days, he met with each of the families of his students. Then, thinking his duty done, returned to school, only to find that he now had a new urge to go and preach to the wider population. Annoyed, he set up a meeting at the Troy Town Hall. When he arrived, he found that the hall was packed. But when he got up to preach, the words just wouldn't come. For the next 20 minutes, he fumbled around, trying in vain to put together a coherent presentation, and finally took his seat, unable to continue. Taking a walk in the woods afterwards, James wondered why he had failed when he had done what God had asked him to do. It was then, and only then, that he realized that he was still holding on to the things of the world. He was still dreaming of becoming a teacher, and he desired earthly gain. Upon realizing this, he knelt down and right then and there surrendered himself completely to God, devoting himself only to his work. Soon after this, he began to arrange preaching tours. During some of these tours, he had very interesting experiences, a couple of which we will go over here. One of the things that he had to deal with often on his preaching tours was a belief that was popular at the time and is still around today, known as universalism. Universalism is the belief that God is so merciful and is so loving to every person that no one will be lost and that everyone will be saved regardless of what they have done or their relationship to Christ. On one occasion, a universalist interrupted his meeting, declaring that he could prove from the Bible that the idea of animals being in heaven was ridiculous and unbiblical. He then stated that he could prove his point from the 65th chapter of Daniel. Slightly amused, James invited him to read the text up front. The universalist came forward and began frantically searching in his Bible for the book of Daniel, then declaring that obviously Daniel had been torn out of it. By now, both James and the congregation were quite amused. James then handed the man his Bible and said he could use it. The man began frantically looking through that. And it was at this point that James explained to the man that there are only 12 chapters in the book of Daniel, and that he must be speaking of Isaiah chapter 65. After James read a few verses from this passage, the man agreed that yes, it was the chapter. But then he continued reading until he came to the verse that speaks of the wolf and the lamb, the lion and the bullock. Realizing that he had just made an absolute fool of himself, the man slunk back to his seat, only to rise at the end of the meeting, asking Elder White to pray for him to become a true Christian. On a later tour, another Universalist minister interrupted his meeting and requested an opportunity to give a rebuttal, and that James should ask the congregation to stay so he could have this opportunity. But James then said that he had no further claims on the congregation. All but 25 congregants promptly left. Angered, the Universalist minister vowed revenge. The following evening, James arrived at the church to find, or actually it was a schoolhouse, arrived at the schoolhouse and found it surrounded by a mob of about 300 individuals. He was able to make his way into the church, and at that point he was informed by a man who stepped out in front of him in the aisle that the mob outside was a result of his conduct the previous evening, and that his meeting would be broken up. His only reply was, "If it be the will of God, let it be so." So many people had come out to this meeting that even though it was the dead of winter, women and children were seated inside, and men were outside, and the windows had been removed so that they could also hear. Well, as James took his place behind the pulpit and began to pray, a snowball whizzed past his head and hit the wall behind him. Soon, more snowballs followed and splattered all over the place. His Bible was soon too wet to read from, and the shouts of the mob were so loud, James could hardly be heard. The previous evening, someone had thrown a spike or large nail at James as he had been preaching. It had hit him in the head, but had not injured him, and he had reached down, picked it up, and put it in his pocket. Now, he took that same spike from his pocket and gave a powerful illustration. Holding it high above his head and raising his voice to be heard above the mob, he said, "Some poor sinner threw this spike at me last evening. God pity him. The worst I wish for him is that he is as happy as I am at this moment." Then, backing up against the wall, he spread his arms wide and said, "Why should I resent this insult when my master had spikes driven through his hands?" When the meeting had closed, James got his stuff together, grabbed his Bible and the chart that he'd hung on the wall, and went to leave. But as he opened the door and stepped out onto the snow, the mob rushed him. Suddenly, a man appeared at James' side and linked arms with him. And as he walked forward, the mob parted, allowing them through. When they were a safe distance away, James turned to thank this man, but he had vanished. Now, let's move to the story of Joseph Bates. Joseph Bates' story starts a little bit earlier, at the later end of the 18th century. He was born on July the 8th, 1892, in Rochester, Massachusetts, to Joseph Bates Sr. and Deborah Bates. A year after his birth, his family moved to the whaling town of New Bedford, and it was here that Joseph Bates gained a love of the sea. At the age of 15, after pleading with his parents for many, many weeks and years, they finally agreed to let him sail, and he signed on to a ship called the Fanny as a cabin boy. Little did he know that this was the start of a series of many exciting adventures, the first of which happened on this very voyage. Elder Bates tells us about it on page 24 of his autobiography. In the morning, Sunday, a large shark was following us. A large piece of meat was fastened to a rope and thrown over the stern to tempt him to come up a little nearer, that we might fasten to him with a barbed iron made for such purposes. But no inducement of ours seemed to affect him. He maintained his position where he could grasp whatever fell from either side of the ship. Toward the evening of the day referred to, When we had ceased our fruitless labors to draw the shark away from his determined position astern of the ship, I ascended the main topgallant masthead to ascertain if there was any vessel in sight, or anything to be seen but sky and water. On my way down, having reached about 50 feet from the deck and 60 from the water, I missed reaching the place which I designed to grasp with my hand and fell backward, striking a rope in my fall, which prevented my being dashed upon the deck, but whirled me into the sea. As I came up on top of the waves, struggling and panting for breath, I saw at a glance that the ship, my only hope, was passing onward beyond my reach. With the encumbrance of my thick, heavy clothing, I exerted all my strength to follow. I saw that the captain, officers, and crew had rushed to the ship's stern. The first officer hurled a coil of rope with all his strength, the end of which I caught with my hand. He cried out, "Hold on!" I did so until they hauled me through the sea to the ship and set my feet on the deck. To the question if I was hurt, I answered, "No." Said another, "Where is the shark?" I began to tremble even as they had done while they were in anxious suspense, fearing he would grasp me every moment. The thought of the shark had never entered my mind while I was in the water. I then crossed over to the other side of the ship, and behold, he was quietly gliding along his way with us, not far from the side of the vessel, seemingly unconscious of our gaze. And we did not disturb him in any way, for the sailors and passengers were all so glad that the cabin boy was rescued, not only from a watery grave, but from his ferocious jaws, that they had no disposition to trouble him. He was soon missing, and we saw him no more. But the wonder to all was how he had came to change his position to a place where he could neither see nor hear what was transpiring on the other side and stern of the ship. Now, as I said, this was only the beginning. During his next voyage, the war between England and France, just prior to the War of 1812, was raging. An ally of France and Napoleon was Denmark. So, when the Fanny stopped in Ireland for repairs and sailed through Danish waters, the ship was captured by Danish privateers. And after a session of the Danish maritime court, the ship and cargo were promptly confiscated. This left Bates with finding a way to get home. He got passage on a ship to England, but he couldn't find a ship going to America from England. Then, one evening, as he and one of his fellow seamen were staying at an inn, British soldiers entered and arrested them and impressed them into the British Navy. For the next 5 years, he was in British custody, for the first 2 as a British sailor, and the next 3 as a prisoner of war during the War of 1812. During this time with the British, he survived a sea battle, 4 attempts at escaping, and a massacre of prisoners at Dartmoor Prison in England. 3 years after he finally returned home, in June of 1815, he married Prudence Nye on February 15, 1818. He continued his career as a sailor, but was singular in his abstinence from alcohol and tobacco. Yet he still did not have Christ in his heart. But an event soon occurred which caused Bates to search for Christ. By 1824, he had risen to the point of becoming captain of his own ship. But on one voyage in particular, a sailor under him became deathly sick. Bates had this boy moved to his personal sleeping quarters so he could care for him. The sailor, whose name was Christopher, began telling him about his life and how he wished he had continued to go to his church as his mother had taught him. Then he made Bates promise that if he died, he would be buried as a Christian. Then, one afternoon, Bates went to his quarters to rest. As he took off his boots, he asked Christopher how he was doing. He smiled and nodded, and then Joseph laid back on his bed and fell asleep. He woke up a few hours later and asked Christopher how he was, but he got no response. he walked over and laid his hand on Christopher's head to find it ice cold. Funeral preparations were made, and Bates officiated. After reading a service from a Church of England prayer book, Joseph ordered the burial to take place, and Christopher, who had been sewn into a hammock with a bag of sand at the bottom, slid into the sea. Directly after the funeral, Bates went to a secret place in the ship and there surrendered his life to Christ. In 1827, he was baptized into the Christian Connection Church. After retiring from sailing in 1828, Bates busied himself in social reforms, helping found the Seamen's Friends Society, the Fairhaven Temperance Society, which was one of the first temperance societies in existence, and the Fairhaven Anti-Slavery Society. He also decided to move his family and built this house in 1832. But a thing happened in his life in the fall of 1839, which was to change his life forever. He was working in his orchard when the minister of the local Christian Connection Church rode up and asked him whether he would be available to listen to him speak the following night. Bates stated that he was, but asked why and what the topic would be. The minister answered, the second coming of Christ. Bates was a bit doubtful, but he agreed. When he arrived at the meeting, he was still quite doubtful, but when he left the evening, he was in a completely different frame of mind. Riding home in almost complete silence with his wife, he finally said with a very forceful voice, "That is the truth." To which his wife replied, "Oh, you are so sanguine always." But Elder Bates had made up his mind, and after more study, he himself began to preach the message. Now, one of his greatest accomplishments as an Advent preacher was to successfully preach to the slaves in the South in early 1844. He had a few encounters, which we will now tell about here. Being known quite well as an abolitionist, an activist for abolishing slavery, it was dangerous for him to go south, but he was determined to take the message to all the world. So he and another Advent believer, Brother Herman Gurney, went south. One of their first experiences was on Kent Island in the Chesapeake Bay. During the last meeting in their series there, a Methodist minister stood up and claimed that he could destroy the Advent message in 10 minutes. Bates replied, "We will hear you." The man then launched into his argument, which he soon ran out of, and switched over to a rant about how he would ride them out of town on a rail. Now here we see a little bit of Bates' wit and humor, because when this man stated this, he replied, "We are all ready for that, sir. If you will put a saddle on it, we would rather ride than walk." At this point, the whole room burst into uproarious laughter, and the bewildered man couldn't reply. But Bates' answer had gained him a friend, for he recounts that after the meeting, this man walked up to him. In a few minutes more, Mr. Kent shook me heartily by the hand and said, "Bates, come and see us." Now, in one particular meeting, there was a large group of enslaved individuals. Before the sermon, Brother Gurney sang a hymn, "I'm a pilgrim and I'm a stranger." Apparently, as these slaves listened, one of them was so deeply touched that afterwards he came up to Brother Gurney, and Bates tells us what happened. One of the colored men came to our lodging to beg one of the printed copies. Brother Gurney had but one. He said, "I'll give you $0.25 for it." It was probably all the money the poor man had. He lingered as though he could not be denied. Brother Gurney then copied it for him, which pleased him very much. And now we will switch to the story of Ellen Harmon, or as we know her today, Ellen White. Ellen Harmon and her twin sister Elizabeth were born on November 26, 1827, to Robert and Eunice Harmon in Gorham, Maine. Not long after their birth, the family moved to the city of Portland. where Mr. Harmon ran a hat shop. And it was here that an event happened in Ellen's life that drastically changed it. In one afternoon in 1836, when she was 9 years old, she and her sister were returning home from school when she sustained a terrible injury. She tells us in Life Sketches, page 17, paragraph 2, what happened. In company with my twin sister and one of our schoolmates, I was crossing a common in the city of Portland when a girl about 13 years of age, becoming angry at some trifle, followed us, threatening to strike us. Our parents had taught us never to contend with anyone, but if we were in danger of being abused or injured, to hasten home at once. We were doing this with all speed, but the girl followed us as rapidly, with a stone in her hand. I turned my head to see how far she was behind me, and as I did so, she threw the stone and it hit me on the nose. I was stunned by the blow and fell senseless to the ground. Unconscious, she was carried by her sister and the friend to a nearby store, and here she was assessed by all those present. When she became conscious, a man offered to take her home in his carriage, but she refused because she was covered in blood and didn't want to get his carriage dirty. But they had only walked a few yards when Ellen fainted and had to be carried the rest of the way home. She regained consciousness 3 weeks later, and it was then only realized the extent of her injuries. Soon after, her father, who had been away on business in Georgia, returned. As he entered the house, he greeted all the other children, but then inquired where Ellen was. When she was pointed out by her brother, her father didn't recognize her. At first, he didn't believe it was her, and this, she says, cut her to the heart. Now, a little while before, a woman had come to visit Ellen's mother. As she talked, the woman asked if they had talked to Ellen about dying. When her mother replied that she had not, she reprimanded her, saying that if she did not prepare her, she would burn in hell forever. Ellen overheard this conversation, and it caused her to begin to search for God. Not long after, in the year 1840, William Miller came to Portland for the first time, preaching in the church on Casco Street. His arguments were convincing, and this caused Ellen's conviction to be deepened that she needed Jesus. But as her conviction deepened, it got to the point that she was afraid to sleep at night for fear that she would die in her sleep and not be saved. A year passed, and at a Methodist camp meeting held in Buxton, Maine, the Harmon family were among those in attendance. One evening, a sermon was preached that gave Ellen great hope. The minister referenced the story of Esther and showed that God always welcomes the repentant sinner. An altar call was given, and as many made their way forward, Ellen went with them. Kneeling at the altar, she poured her heart out to Jesus. Suddenly, she felt a burden lifted and felt as though Jesus were very near to her. Soon, a woman nearby asked Ellen whether she had found Jesus, but before she could answer, the woman said that there was no need to, because she could see it in her face. Not long after this, she was baptized and accepted into the Methodist Church. In 1842, William Miller again visited Portland, and Ellen at this time had become discouraged, but was greatly cheered by Miller's talks, and it also caused her to renew her resolve to be prepared for his coming. But unfortunately, what she had been taught about hell began to terrify her and cause her to doubt God's love. At night, she would wait until her sister had fallen asleep. Then she would kneel by her bed and plead with God through the night until sunrise. Describing her condition in Testimonies to the Church, Volume 1, she states, "I thought that the fate of the condemned sinner would be mine, to endure the flames of hell forever, even as long as God himself existed. This impression deepened upon my mind until I feared that I would lose my reason. I would look upon the dumb beasts with envy, because they had no soul to be punished after death. Many times the wish arose that I had never been born." Then she had a dream that convinced her that she was lost and that God had left her forever. But the following night, she had another dream in which she was given a personal audience with Christ. His love and tenderness in the dream convinced her to tell her mother of her struggles. When her mother heard the story, she advised Ellen to counsel with an elder Stockman, a local Advent preacher. This she did, and when she finished telling her experience, Elder Stockman's eyes filled with tears. With his hand on Ellen's shoulder, he said, "Ellen, you are only a child. Yours is a most singular experience for one of your tender age. Jesus must be preparing you for some special work." Little did he know how true his words were. Around this time, the ministers of the organized denominations began resisting the Advent message. One evening, at a youth meeting held at the Harmons Church, when testimonies were being asked for, Ellen rose and gave her story of how she had overcome her doubts and despair. But when she attributed her experience to the Advent hope, she was abruptly interrupted by the class leader who said, "You received sanctification through Methodism. Through Methodism, sister, not through any erroneous theory." They did not know that this would be their last meeting with their Methodist brothers and sisters. Soon after, Robert Harmon, her father, was notified that their pastor would be visiting them. When the minister arrived, he told the family that they must drop their Millerite beliefs because they did not agree with Methodism and were new and strange beliefs. When Mr. Harmon countered that Christ and his apostles had taught these very same beliefs, an argument ensued in which Mr. Harmon was able to produce text after text to support his beliefs. The pastor abruptly halted the conversation, declaring that they must drop their beliefs or be expelled from the church. Mr. Harmon stood his ground, and the pastor recommended that they withdraw from the church to avoid the publicity of a church trial. Mr. Harmon stated that they preferred to have a trial because they wanted to know where they were varying from Bible teaching. The trial was an underhanded dealing. Because Mr. Harmon was a very influential member of the church, the pastor invited to the trial only those members that he knew would support his decision. The verdict was set before the trial began. As a result, the next Sunday, at the beginning of their love feast, the names of all the members of the family were read up front, removing them from the church books. I'm a Stranger, which is the song that I mentioned in there by Brother Gurney, that Brother Gurney sang.